Ada, I cut contact with my mother on Christmas Eve because she told my 4-year-old niece she is an affair child that no one ever wanted. My brother, now 43, had always been the embodiment of contradiction. Charming, successful, and the life of the party, yet deeply flawed in ways that left ripples of hurt across the lives of those who cared about him. When I was a child, he often felt like a larger-than-life figure 14 years older, practically a second father at times, and someone I both idolized and feared. He was the golden boy who always seemed to have the answers, even when his actions hinted at a chaos he could barely contain. But nothing had prepared me for the storm that came with the revelation of his affair and the child it produced. 4 years ago, in what seemed like a plotline ripped straight from a soap opera, my brother's carefully curated life shattered. His daughter, a tiny, sweet, and painfully shy girl, was born out of an affair that he had managed to conceal from everyone: his wife, our family, and the world at large for 2 long years. He had perfected the art of living a devil life, slipping in and out of roles with an ease that was both infuriating and bewildering. When the truth came out, it wasn't a gentle revelation. It exploded. The affair itself had been bad enough, but hiding the existence of a child? That was a betrayal so profound it left his wife, our family, and even himself reeling. To make matters worse, he hadn't just hidden the girl physically, he'd tried to compartmentalize her emotionally, treating her more as a secret than a human being. He would visit sporadically, sometimes staying for hours and other times for entire days, showering her with gifts and attention as if that could somehow compensate for the vast, echoing gaps in between. This inconsistency wasn't just a strain on her mother. It was soul-crushing for the little girl. At 2 years old, she was already old enough to understand that her daddy came and went unpredictably, leaving a trail of empty promises in his wake. She would light up when he arrived, her face beaming with a joy so pure it could break your heart, only to be left wondering why he hadn't come back or called for weeks. Her mother, rightfully furious, reached her breaking point and issued an ultimatum. Either he stepped up and fully acknowledged his daughter legally, financially, and emotionally, or he could stop coming around entirely. She wasn't going to let their daughter live in limbo, always teetering between hope and heartbreak. It was too toxic for her, too unfair. I couldn't blame her. As much as I loved my brother, his behavior was indefensible. He had always been able to charm his way out of trouble, but this wasn't a mess that could be cleaned up with a grin and a smooth apology. He needed to make a choice, to commit fully to his responsibilities or to walk away for good, painful as that would be. Anything less was a cruelty neither the child nor her mother deserved. For my brother, this ultimatum was a turning point, or at least, I hoped it was. He seemed genuinely rattled for the first time, confronted with the reality of the damage he was causing. He began making an effort, visiting more consistently, setting up financial support, and trying, in his own imperfect way, to carve out a place for this little girl in his life. But old habits die hard, and he was still prone to lapses in judgment. Sometimes, weeks would pass with no word from him, leaving the girl confused and upset, and her mother livid. It was hard to watch. The girl, despite everything, was sweet, gentle, and far too forgiving. Her world revolved around the crumbs of attention her father doled out, and it broke my heart to see her light up at his arrival, only to be left clinging to memories of a fleeting visit. Her mother, fierce and exhausted, carried the weight of raising her alone while also dealing with the fallout of my brother's erratic involvement. She was in her late 20s, barely older than me, but the lines of stress and hurt on her face made her seem much older. I admired her resilience, even when she was sharp with me, blaming our family for enabling his behavior. The whole situation cast a shadow over our family. My brother's wife had been the glue holding things together, even as his infidelity strained their marriage. When the affair came to light, their relationship crumbled, and the fallout was brutal. My mother, already prone to dramatic displays, latched onto the scandal with a ferocity that shocked even me. She vilified the other woman, calling her every name under the sun, as if my brother hadn't played an equal if not greater role in the destruction of his marriage. The hypocrisy of it all was maddening. And yet, through all this, the little girl remained at the center of it all, an innocent caught in the crossfire of adult mistakes and grudges. It wasn't her fault that she existed, yet she bore the weight of being the affair baby, a label she was far too young to understand, but one that would undoubtedly follow her for the rest of her life. Even now, I think about how unfair it all was to her mother, and to the family my brother had betrayed. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't help but hope that he might rise to the occasion, that he might prove to be the father she needed, even if it was years too late. But deep down, I knew better. My brother was who he was: flawed, selfish, and ultimately unreliable. And the cost of his failings was a burden this sweet little girl would carry far longer than she should have to. In the years since the truth about my brother's daughter came to light, I've seen glimmers of change in him, fleeting moments where he seemed genuinely determined to do better. This Christmas, it seemed, was going to be one of those rare occasions. For the first time, he wanted his daughter to join the family for the holidays, a decision I hoped marked a turning point in his journey toward being a proper father. The girl was thrilled. For weeks, she talked about meeting her grandma and spending Christmas with her daddy. Her excitement was infectious, and as much as I harbored skepticism about my brother's ability to follow through, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this time he would deliver. After all, Christmas is supposed to be a time for family, for forgiveness, for making things right. Perhaps he'd finally understood how important it was to show up, not just in words but in actions. But, as had become an unfortunate pattern with him, reality didn't align with those hopeful expectations. Just days before Christmas, he called me, his voice harried and full of excuses. There was an urgent business meeting abroad, he said. A deal that couldn't wait. If he didn't attend, he stood to lose thousands of euros. His reasoning was frustratingly familiar, wrapped in the same thin veneer of justification he'd used for so many broken promises in the past. It's just bad timing, he said, as though timing was ever good when it came to disappointing a child. I sighed, too drained to argue. Fine. Whatever, I said, though it wasn't fine, not by a long shot. The damage was already done. His daughter had been counting down the days, her little heart set on spending the holiday with him. Now, he wouldn't even be there. The thought of her disappointment was unbearable, and though I knew it wasn't my responsibility to fix this, I couldn't let her face it alone. That's when he asked me the impossible. Could you still take her to the family dinner? He asked, his tone both hopeful and pleading. I know I messed up, but she shouldn't have to miss out. She's been so excited. Part of me wanted to refuse. It wasn't my job to clean up his messes, and the idea of navigating the minefield of our family dynamics without him felt overwhelming. But then I thought of his daughter, of the way her eyes lit up whenever she talked about Christmas. She was a sweet child, overly sensitive and shy, perhaps, but heartbreakingly earnest. She didn't deserve to have her holiday ruined because of her father's inability to prioritize her. So, I agreed. I'll take her, I said, though my stomach churned at the thought of how it might all go. The day arrived, and as I picked her up, I could see how much this meant to her. She wore a festive dress, her hair neatly combed, clutching a small wrapped gift she'd made herself. This is for Grandma, she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. She'd drawn a picture, a colorful scene of a Christmas tree with presents beneath it, surrounded by smiling stick figures. It was sweet and simple, a child's effort to express her excitement and love. On the drive to our mother's house, I tried to prepare her for what lay ahead, though how do you explain dysfunction to a 4-year-old? Everyone's excited to meet you, I said, keeping my tone light even as I suppressed a nagging sense of dread. Just be yourself. You're going to do great. But as we pulled into the driveway, that dread grew heavier. My mother's drinking had become a serious issue in recent years, exacerbated by her bitterness over my brother's failed marriage and the scandal of his affair. She'd always had a close relationship with my ex-sister-in-law, and when their marriage imploded, she seemed to take it personally, as though the loss of that bond was an affront to her own sense of stability. Inside, the house was warm and festive, the tree glowing with lights and ornaments collected over decades. The air smelled of roasting turkey and mulled wine, a stark contrast to the tension simmering beneath the surface. The family greeted us warmly enough, though there were awkward glances and whispers as they took in the sight of my brother's daughter. She, for her part, was painfully polite, clinging to my hand as we navigated the room. When she presented her gift to my mother, I held my breath, hoping against hope that this would be a moment of connection, a step toward acceptance. "I made this for you," the little girl said shyly, holding out the package with trembling hands. My mother took it, her expression unreadable. "Oh," she said after a pause, her tone flat and devoid of warmth. She opened the gift and stared at the drawing, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then, without warning, she set it aside and turned away, muttering something under her breath about kids these days. The girl's face crumpled, her lower lip trembling as she fought back tears. "She didn't like it," she whispered to me, her voice so small I could barely hear it. "She loved it," I lied, crouching down to her level. "Grandma's just tired. It's been a long day." But the truth was harder to ignore. My mother's coldness wasn't fatigue, it was resentment. Resentment toward a child who had done nothing wrong, who existed simply because of choices my brother had made. And when the girl finally burst into tears, asking to go home, my mother didn't comfort her. Instead, she seized the moment to lash out further, her words cutting and cruel. "You're a child no one wanted," she snapped, her voice slurring with the weight of too much wine. "Your existence ruined this family." The room fell silent. I felt my heart drop, a mix of rage and heartbreak threatening to overwhelm me. Before I could even react, my mother turned her anger toward the girl's mother, who wasn't even present to defend herself. "That little H0E, she spat, venom dripping from every syllable. She knew he was married. She destroyed everything." I could barely process what was happening. The cruelty, the venom, it was too much. I scooped the sobbing girl into my arms and stormed out, leaving the stunned silence of the family behind us. I called my brother from the car, shaking with anger as I recounted what had happened. He was furious, swearing he would cut all financial support to our mother, though it felt like too little, too late. We spent the night at a hotel, the festive glow of Christmas lights outside a hollow contrast to the devastation inside. I tried to comfort the girl as best as I could, but her heart had been broken in a way that no words or gestures could mend. For her, Christmas had been ruined, not by Santa or a lack of presents, but by the very people who should have made her feel loved and safe. My mother's drinking had always been a source of tension in our family, but since my brother's divorce, it had escalated into something darker, more relentless. She had always been prone to excess, but the way she clung to the bottle now seemed almost like a desperate attempt to drown out the echoes of everything she'd lost. My ex-sister-in-law had been a rare source of stability for her, someone who treated her with respect and kindness despite my brother's flaws. When the marriage fell apart, it was as if my mother took the divorce as a personal betrayal, compounding her already volatile relationship with the world. It was no surprise that she drank too much that Christmas, though I had hoped she might rein it in, at least for the sake of her grandchildren. By the time we arrived, the telltale signs were already there: her flushed cheeks, the slight slur in her words, the way she swayed just a little when she stood up. She was still functioning, still putting on the act of being the matriarch hosting a family holiday, but the cracks were impossible to ignore. The little girl, oblivious to the undercurrents, approached her with a timid smile, clutching the gift she had worked so hard on. I could see how much it meant to her, this small gesture of love and connection. "Grandma," she said softly, holding out the neatly wrapped drawing, "I made this for you." For a moment, I dared to hope. My mother looked at the gift, her eyes narrowing as she took it from the girl's hands. She unwrapped it with deliberate slowness, revealing the bright, crayon-colored scene of a Christmas tree surrounded by smiling stick figures. It was sweet, simple, and filled with the kind of innocent love that only a child can offer. But instead of the warmth and gratitude the girls so desperately sought, my mother's response was cold, almost dismissive. "Oh," she said flatly, barely glancing at the drawing before setting it aside on the coffee table. "That's nice." The little girl's face fell. "You don't like it," she whispered, her voice trembling. My mother didn't answer. She picked up her wine glass and took a long sip, her attention already elsewhere. The rejection hung in the air like a dark cloud, and I could feel the weight of it settling on the girl's small shoulders. She looked at me, her big, tear-filled eyes searching for reassurance. "She's just tired," I lied, forcing a smile that felt hollow even as I said it. "It's a beautiful drawing. You did such a good job." But the damage was done. The girl's lip began to tremble, and I could see her trying to hold back tears. She clutched at the hem of her dress, her little hands fidgeting as if she could somehow keep herself from falling apart. "I want to go home," she said suddenly, her voice breaking. "I want my mummy." I bent down to comfort her, but before I could say anything, my mother's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Your mummy," she sneered, the words dripping with contempt. "That little H0E. She knew he was married. She's the reason this family is falling apart." The room went silent. All the light-hearted chatter, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of wrapping paper, it all stopped as everyone turned to look at her in shock. I stared at my mother, unable to believe what I had just heard. "Mom," I said sharply, my voice trembling with anger, "stop it. Right now." But she wasn't finished. She pointed a finger at the girl, her hand unsteady, and said the words that would haunt me for years. "You're a child no one wanted. Your existence destroyed this family." It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The little girl burst into tears, her small body shaking with sobs as she buried her face in her hands. I could feel my own heart breaking, the weight of my mother's cruelty pressing down on me like a physical force. Without thinking, I scooped the girl up into my arms and carried her out of the room. My mother's voice followed us, slurring insults about the girl's mother, about my brother, about everything and everyone except herself. I didn't stop until we were outside, the cold air biting at my skin as I held the girl close, trying to calm her. "It's okay," I whispered, though it wasn't okay at all. "You're okay. None of that was your fault." She clung to me, her small hands gripping my coat as if I were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned terrifying. "I want to go home," she sobbed again, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I want Mommy." I nodded, my own tears threatening to spill over. "I'll take you home," I promised. "We'll leave right now." But before I could get her into the car, I had to make one call. I dialed my brother's number, my hands shaking with rage as I recounted everything that had just happened. He was silent at first, but when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with anger I had rarely heard from him. "I'm cutting her off," he said, his words clipped and full of finality. "No more money. No more help. She's done." I wanted to tell him that it wasn't enough, that no amount of financial consequences could undo the harm she had just inflicted on his daughter. But I didn't have the energy to argue. I ended the call and got the girl into the car, driving her back to her mother's house as quickly as I could. We spent the night at a hotel, the sterile room a far cry from the warmth and joy of a proper Christmas celebration. The girl fell asleep clutching the stuffed animal I'd bought her from the hotel gift shop, her small body curled into a ball as if she were trying to protect herself from the world. As I sat in the dim light of the room, I thought about my mother and the ways her drinking had poisoned so much of our lives. My father had been no better, disappearing into the void of his own addictions years ago. We had grown up poor, not just in money but in love and stability, scraping by as our parents spiraled further into their own dysfunction. My brother and I had promised ourselves we would be different, that we wouldn't let their mistakes define us. But here we were, caught in the same cycle of pain and regret. I couldn't stop thinking about the little girl, about the way she had tried so hard to be accepted, only to be met with rejection and cruelty. She deserved better. They all did. The night at the hotel was quiet, but not peaceful. The little girl lay curled up on the bed, clutching the small stuffed animal I'd bought her from the gift shop. Her tears had dried, but the sadness in her eyes lingered, a weight far too heavy for someone so young. I sat nearby, staring at the faint glow of the television, its sound muted, as my mind churned over everything that had happened. I had told my mother I didn't want to see her again, and I meant it. For years, I had tried to excuse her behavior, attributing her bitterness to her difficult life and the scars of her own childhood. But this was unforgivable. To blame an innocent child, to spew such venom at someone who simply wanted to be loved, was a cruelty I couldn't overlook. My mother had always had her demons, but this was a line crossed too far. My brother, for all his flaws, had created this situation. His serial cheating, his lies, his selfishness, it had all culminated in this little girl, a child who bore the brunt of everyone's anger and resentment. His wife had tolerated so much, but a child was the breaking point. And while I couldn't blame her for leaving, I also couldn't ignore the fact that my brother's actions had left his daughter in a no-man's land, caught between a family that didn't know how to love her and a father who barely understood what it meant to be present. As I watched the girl sleep, her tiny frame so still and fragile, guilt gnawed at me. I hadn't bought her a gift. In the chaos of trying to navigate my brother's last-minute request and manage the family gathering, I had overlooked something so basic, so vital. My brother had claimed he'd given money to our mother to buy the girl a present, but of course, my mother had done nothing with it. Instead, she'd allowed the girl to sit there, surrounded by other children her age who gleefully unwrapped their gifts, while she had nothing. The image of her sitting there, her small face hopeful but slowly turning confused and then quietly resigned, haunted me. She hadn't thrown a tantrum or demanded attention. Instead, she'd shown a strange, heartbreaking maturity, asking one of the other children if she could see their new doll. "You must have been really nice to get such a pretty gift," she had said, her voice tinged with a wistfulness that cut through me like a knife. I hated my family in that moment. I hated the dysfunction that had led us to this place, the bitterness and selfishness that seemed to taint everything we touched. Most of all, I hated how this innocent child had been caught in the crossfire, made to feel unwanted and unloved on what should have been a magical night. The next morning, I called her mother. "She's fine," I assured her, though it wasn't entirely true. She was upset, but I'm bringing her back now. I'll make sure she gets home safely. Her mother, who had every reason to be angry, was surprisingly understanding. "Thank you for taking care of her," she said, her voice weary but sincere. "I hope one day she'll have better memories of Christmas." After I dropped the girl off, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. The weight of the night before hung heavy on me. I knew I couldn't fix everything: my brother's mistakes, my mother's bitterness, the cracks in our family that seemed too deep to mend, but I could do something. I decided then and there to be more present in the little girl's life. She deserved to have someone who cared about her, who could show her that she was valued, even if her father continued to falter. I reached out to my brother later that day. "You need to do better," I told him, my voice firm. "Not just with her, but with everything. You can't keep expecting other people to clean up your messes." He was defensive at first, as he always was, but I didn't let up. "This isn't about you anymore," I said. "It's about her. She deserves better than what you are giving her." To my surprise, he didn't argue. He sighed heavily, and for a moment, I thought I heard genuine regret in his voice. "I know," he said quietly. "I'll try." I didn't hold my breath. My brother's promises had always been more about easing his own guilt than actually following through. But even so, I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe this time would be different. As for my mother, I meant what I said. I cut contact with her, at least for the foreseeable future. She had always been a toxic presence in our lives, and I realized I couldn't keep excusing her behavior just because she was my mother. The cycle had to end somewhere, and for me, it ended here. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the girl's face as she watched the other children open their gifts. That quiet acceptance, that strange, mature understanding it wasn't right. She deserved to feel the joy and magic of Christmas, just like any other child. So, I made a promise to myself. Next year, I wouldn't let this happen again. I would plan ahead, make sure she had something special under the tree, and create a holiday memory she could cherish. It wouldn't undo the hurt of this year, but it would be a start. Because if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that love isn't just about words. It's about showing up, about doing the work, about making sure the people you care about know they matter. And if my brother couldn't do that for his daughter, then I would. No child should ever feel unwanted. And as long as I could help it, this little girl wouldn't have to.